I call this hearing of the Federal Spending Oversight Subcommittee to order. 2 weeks ago today, the federal government reached its credit limit. As a nation, we owe almost $20 trillion, about $60,000 for each American alive now, including children. Yet we're told that $20 trillion is not that much, and that it may well grow, and that sometime soon we're going to have to ask again to raise the debt ceiling. This is what we want to explore here today. What is our debt situation, how it impacts our budget, and how should we respond? Some argue that raising the debt should just be automatic. We really shouldn't debate about it, that any debate or amendments would suggest the possibility of default and that that would be dangerous. I don't want to default, but I also think it's wrong for Congress to approve more borrowing without necessary reforms and without making this a point to try to find a chance to fix some of the situation we have. I think it's a mistake also, though, to scare the markets and to talk of default and say default will occur if we don't have this vote immediately. If you look at our monthly average cash flow, the federal government is able to actually pay its interest on the debt, salaries for our troops, Social Security, and really much more, even if we didn't raise the debt ceiling. In fact, on an annualized basis, we can fund 86% of government without net borrowing. So default is not necessarily an unavoidable occurrence if the debt limit is not raised. Now, some scholars would argue that we shouldn't worry. We don't really need to ever pay back our debt. Keynes said not to worry about the long run because in the long run, we'll all be dead. Others have argued, the debt can be stabilized or simply inflated away. I don't share these views, but even for those who do, the one thing we cannot outlive or inflate away is the interest on our debt. This year alone, we'll pay $295 billion in interest. This is more than we spend this year on 7 cabinet departments, the White House, Congress, and the courts combined. More concerning is how ongoing deficits mean interest will consume more and more of the budget. I want to draw attention to this chart we have over here on the screen. It shows that our share of federal spending that goes to interest in the debt, discretionary spending, and mandatory spending over the last 30 years. What we see is shocking. Today, the American worker sees roughly 7 cents of their tax dollar going to interest, 30 cents to discretionary spending. But by the time a recent graduate today is near retirement, interest and discretionary spending will be taking an equal share of the tax dollar, roughly 19 cents. So under the current course, interest will progressively squeeze out discretionary spending. So what do we get for interest? Really nothing. Not 1 hour of work, not one sticky note. Now, we always hear that spending today is an investment and that cutting anything would be too devastating. We hear this really from both sides, both the right and the left. This is not a Republican-Democrat problem. This is a both parties problem. We hear right and left, we're always told, we'll be fiscally responsible tomorrow. But tomorrow never comes. We simply cannot continue to rack up the debt at the rate we are. So just 2 months ago, I proposed a budget that would balance in 5 years without touching Social Security and without an actual spending cut. Simply by freezing spending over 5 years, we would balance the budget. Yet only 14 senators had the courage to vote for such a budget. So this brings me to my last point. Doing the right thing is hard and often not politically expedient. Congress rarely makes simple, unpleasant choices, which means we end up facing difficult and unavoidable catastrophic problems. We only act when circumstances force us to. This is why the debt limit is important. It's our internal credit limit, not that of our creditors. It's an opportunity to reassess our spending and ask, how do we get here and how do we get out of this mess? Answering those questions as part of past debt limit debates have spawned most, if not all, of the federal process reforms. The most notable example was the '74 Budget Act. But Gramm-Rudman-Hollins, pay-as-you-go, all of the sequester, all came out of the debt limit debates. So when people say, oh, no, we should just hurry up and raise the debt limit without any reforms, it's exactly wrong, it's historically wrong, and every time we've ever gotten any process reform to try to fix it, it's been with a debt limiting debate. So I think we shouldn't shy away from having a real debate when we raise the debt limit. The Budget Act of '74 was supposed to be an improvement and fix problems, but big spenders have over 40 years, they've had 40 years to figure it out, and they largely have evaded it now. My hope is that, once again, as we debate raising the debt ceiling, though, that we can reform spending and have significant reforms that will put us on the right course. With that, I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Peters for his opening statement. But before I do that, I'd just like to note that this is Senator Peters' first hearing as Ranking Member of this subcommittee. I'd like to welcome him and look forward to working with you. Senator Peters.
Well, thank you, Chairman Paul. Thank you for the welcome, and it's a pleasure to serve with you. And I look forward to having many productive hearings in the months and years ahead, and for bringing us here today to discuss certainly this very critical topic of the national debt and the pressing matter of the debt ceiling. I'd also like to give a sincere thank you to our distinguished panel of guests. Your perspectives on both the national debt and the debt ceiling is absolutely critical to us as policymakers. And today we will consider what I think are two significant, distinct, and most importantly, solvable problems. Perhaps I'm an optimist, but I'm finding sustainable solutions for our nation's debt as well as finding a path forward on the debt ceiling are both problems that can and should be solved in a responsible, bipartisan manner. To me, working in a bipartisan manner on these issues is the only path forward. It is what I believe we were sent here to do, to find the solutions that put America on a path towards a sustainable fiscal future. As 2017 progresses, we are going to hear many schoolhouse rocks explanations of the debt limit, the statutory and arbitrary constraint on the amount of money the U.S. Treasury can borrow. Much of the conversation will be focused on questions like, when is the right time to talk about solutions for the long-term debt and deficits? We should be constantly working towards fiscal responsibility. This is not and should not be a seasonal debate, and I'm sure the chairman certainly shares that sentiment. But just as we should be constantly engaged in discussions about how to solve our long-term issues, it is wholly irresponsible to turn this debate into one that threatens the full faith and credit of the United States. The global economy relies on the fact that at the end of the day, no matter the chaos in the rest of the world, the United States government will fulfill its obligations and pay its bills. On March 16, 2017, under the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015, the previously suspended debt ceiling was reinstated at just over $18 trillion. Immediately on March 16, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin wrote to Congress to inform us that the United States Treasury was taking extraordinary measures to avoid a breach in the debt ceiling. According to analysis of the debt limit conducted by both the Congressional Budget Office and the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Treasury Department's extraordinary measures may be able to extend the date to which the U.S. government can fulfill its financial obligations into the fall of 2017, perhaps October or November. However, Congress can and should immediately begin discussions to address our obligations. After having been through numerous debates on the debt limit since 2011, it would be the height of irresponsibility to let this debate slip into the midnight hour. I remind my colleagues, while a breach of the debt ceiling would have unprecedented and potentially catastrophic impact on the global economy, brinkmanship alone has the potential to hurt everyday working families. In 2011, as Congress struggled to reach an agreement at the last minute, the U.S. debt was downgraded, consumer confidence fell sharply, and the stock market and credit markets took months to fully stabilize. To some, the debate in Washington may seem abstract, but if we yet again engage in brinksmanship, we are jeopardizing the chance for a working-class family to purchase their first home or take out a loan to buy a much-needed automobile. And we are risking thousands of Americans' retirement savings that they have built up over a lifetime of hard work. And this is simply not acceptable. If there is to be renegotiation on the debt ceiling, I ask my colleagues, let it happen now. We cannot afford to let our differences risk the financial future of everyday Americans. Failure to act is not an option when it comes to long-term debt and deficit reduction. Solving this challenge will take bipartisan cooperation, and it will require a comprehensive approach that addresses all three fundamental factors of deficit reduction: cutting spending, reforming taxes, and investing in economic growth. Budget plans that shift the burden onto one group at the expense of another, or that ignore any of these three basic factors, will not solve the problem. We need to support economic growth. We need to find real solutions to curbing long-term health care costs. We need to reform our tax code into one that promotes job creation and investment here at home in America. We need to make government more efficient, and we need to find responsible ways to cut spending. I hope today serves as an open forum on these issues, both our long-term debt as well as the debt limit. And I know that each of our witnesses is very well informed and highly respected on these topics. So I hope we use this forum, or you use this forum rather, to give us a very honest assessment of these challenges. We may not agree on some of the proposals that we hear, but it is only by engaging in bipartisan, collaborative fashion that we're going to find the solutions that America deserves and the American people are expecting us to come up with. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Peters. With that, I'll begin by introducing our first witness, the Honorable David M. Walker. Mr. Walker is the former Comptroller General of the United States and head of the U.S. Government Accountability Office. He also served as president and CEO of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation and founded Come Back America Initiative. Mr. Walker has written 3 books and is also the subject of the documentary IOUSA about government debt, the topic of today's hearing. So we're happy to have you here, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on the issue. Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Chairman Paul, Ranking Member Peters, Senator Hassan. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today. The title for this hearing is The Effect of Borrowing on Federal Spending. The short answer is there are several implications of our current federal spending and borrowing practices. They include, first, additional debt results in higher interest costs that can serve to crowd out other federal spending, especially discretionary spending, and or increased pressure for tax increases. The CBO has projected that interest costs will be the fastest growing expense in the federal budget on a percentage basis over the next 10 years. And what do we get for interest? As the chairman said, nothing. Excessive levels of debt as a percentage of the economy can serve to reduce economic growth and job opportunities. It can also cause a crisis of confidence in the U.S. dollar and much higher interest rates if the market ever decides that the federal government has lost control of its finances and is not willing to regain control of them. Additional debt serves to mortgage the future of our children, grandchildren, and future generations at a time when they will face increasing competition in a much more interconnected and competitive global marketplace. From a broader perspective, the United States has strayed from many of the key principles and values that it was founded on and which made us great. Since 1913, the federal government has grown from 2% of the nation's economy to about 21% and increasing. In addition, in 1913, the Congress controlled 97% of all federal spending annually. The only thing that it didn't control was interest. Today, in fiscal 2016, 69% of federal spending, including interest, was deemed to be mandatory spending. Shockingly, the 31% of federal spending that was controlled included all of the express and enumerated responsibilities outlined for the federal government under the Constitution and all investments in our future. Discretionary spending is coming under increasing pressure since mandatory spending is increasing at rates faster than the economy due to known demographic trends and rising health care costs. The bottom line is that Congress has lost control of the budget. Our debt burdens are now escalating to imprudent levels, and our collective future is at risk. The federal government is still adding debt faster than the growth rate of the economy, and interest rates have started to rise. The CBO now estimates that interest will be the fastest growing category of spending. As I mentioned before, all the more reason why the Treasury Department should consider issuing 50-plus year bonds as the GAO and I recommended over 10 years ago. Since the beginning of our republic, there have only been 2 times in our history that federal public debt as a percentage of the economy has exceeded 40%. At the end of World War II and the immediate aftermath, and today. According to the GAO, the percentage of debt held by the public is on a path to rise to levels far in excess of the nation's high, absent a major correction in course. Diffusing our nation's debt bomb will require an unprecedented public education engagement effort as a prelude to major budget, tax, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, health care, defense, government organization operations, and yes, even political reforms. The primary mechanism that Congress has used to control the level of debt in the past is the debt ceiling limit. However, it has not proved to be effective in limiting the growth of federal debt, forcing a reconsideration of the proper role of the federal government, including the need to reform mandatory spending programs and tax expenditures. In addition, the federal debt subject to the debt ceiling will soon pass $20 trillion, which is 105% of GDP and 3.5 times higher than it was in the year 2000. In my view, given the recent history, the debt ceiling limit needs to be replaced ultimately with a stronger statutory set of budget controls and a constitutional amendment that would limit public debt to GDP with specific targets and automatic enforcement mechanisms if the targets are not met. As you senators may be aware, there's currently an effort to achieve a state-led convention under Article 5 for a fiscal responsibility provision. My view is debt to GDP is vastly preferable to balanced budget for a variety of reasons. 29 states have now ratified that out of the 34 that are required. Speaking of the states, ultimately when the federal government restructures, bad news flows downhill. A typical state relies upon the federal government for about a third of its finances, as Senator Hassan knows, having been a governor. And we've also started to look at the financial condition and relative competitive posture of the states. I provided an Exhibit C. The members of this subcommittee, their states rank from a high of number 2 in relative financial position to a low of number 49. It's important that the states get their act together too. In summary, we live in a great nation, but we've strayed from the principles and values that made us great. We are currently on an imprudent and unsustainable fiscal path. We need to be honest with ourselves and with the American people. Tough choices are required on the spending revenue side of the budget in order to restore fiscal responsibility, enhance growth, and create a better future. The sooner we start making these choices, the better, so the miracle of compounding can start working for us rather than against us as it is now. I would be happy to answer questions after my colleagues have an opportunity to testify. Thank you again.
Thank you. Our next witness is Veronique de Ruge, who's a senior research fellow at Mercatus Center at George Mason Institute, or George Mason University, and a nationally syndicated columnist. In 2015, she was named the Politico magazine's guide of the top 50 thinkers, doers, and visionaries transforming American politics. That is just one of her many accomplishments. Dr. de Ruge has written extensively on the issues before this committee today, including the dangers of our debt, drivers of it, and she has also put forward some ideas on how to get our budget in order, one of which is dear to me and is rooting out and eliminating waste. Dr. de Ruge, thank you for your being here, and we look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Senator. Chairman Paul, Ranking Member Peters, and member of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I would like to make 3 points. First, since the debt ceiling showdowns of 2011 and 2013, we've actually come a long way in understanding what options are available to us when a debt ceiling crisis occurs. Second, we still need to recognize that fights over the debt ceiling are only a symptom of a more problematic disease, government overspending. The federal government spends too much money, which drives the need to increase its borrowing authority so much and so regularly. Third, the state of affairs is unsustainable. We must address the explosion in mandatory spending, and in particular in entitlement spending. Thankfully, there are a number of institutional reforms and entitlement reform that can be implemented to check the spending that drives the growth in our debt. And the debt ceiling debate is a good time to demand these changes. So let me start. First, during the 2011 debt ceiling debate, my colleague Jason Fichtner and I wrote a paper that explained that when the government reaches the debt ceiling and the Treasury can no longer issue federal debt, it would still have a way to stage off a regrettable default while giving time to Congress to reach an agreement about implementing some reforms that would get us on a more sustainable fiscal path. At the time, we explained that the Treasury Department had several financial management options to continue paying the government's obligation, including prioritizing the debt, liquidating some assets to pay government bills, and using the Social Security Trust Fund to continue paying Social Security benefits. The previous administration, however, initially rejected these options, but now there are actually recognized as acceptable procedures by Treasury, the Congressional Budget Office, and even the Federal Reserve of New York. Now, I'd like to note that we never advocated for any particular measures, and we often lamented that this path had to be pursued because they have a cost. However, we also noted that it was much more responsible than defaulting on our debt or raising the debt ceiling without making any changes to the state of our finances. While there are several instances where Congress has used the debt ceiling as an opportunity, as you've said, Senator, to implement other reforms, for the most part, the debt ceiling was raised without any attempt to control spending. And the result has been a federal debt that has ballooned from less than $5 trillion in 1993 to almost $20 trillion today, and growing. Deficits are also going up. Over the coming decades, the deficit will double to almost 5% of GDP, and CBO predicts that the deficit in the next 10 years will be a total of $10 trillion. $10 trillion. Academic and international organizations have warned us against the negative consequences of not getting our long-term debt under control. Indeed, the consequences would be low economic growth, higher taxes, lower standard of living, which would hurt the neediest of Americans, and the real threat of a debt crisis. Real institutional reforms, as opposed to one-time cut, would change the trajectory of fiscal policy and put the United States on a more sustainable path. Ideally, we would adopt a constitutional amendment to limit spending, but there are reforms that could be implemented immediately, such as adopting a strict cut-as-you-go system or creating a BRAC-like commission for discretionary spending. However, Congress must implement reforms to take control of mandatory spending. Without reform, the rate of spending under Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security will have devastating effects on these programs, but also other government programs and our national economy. Again, without reforms today, vast tax increases will be needed to pay for the $75 trillion unfunded promises we have made to a steadily growing cohort of seniors. Fortunately, many workable solutions are available to lawmakers, like turning Medicaid into a true safety net or modernizing Medicare to address fiscal and structural challenges. Also, rather than focus just on insurance as the only solution to our country's healthcare challenges, we can pursue changes in regulatory policy that can generate the type of healthcare innovation and provider competition that can break the healthcare cost curve to bits, rather than simply bend it temporarily. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you. Finally, I'd like to introduce Mark Zandi. Dr. Zandi is the chief economist of Moody's Analytics, a well-known provider of economic research. He should be familiar to just about anyone who's followed fiscal and economic issues for any amount of time. He's testified numerous times before Congress on fiscal matters and is a regular on the financial networks. Thank you, Dr. Zandi, for coming.
Thank you, Chairman Paul, Senator Peters, Senator Hassan. It's very kind of you to give me the opportunity to participate today. I should mention, just for sake of disclosure, I'm not part of the rating agency, so Moody's, as Moody's Analytics and a separate entity called the Moody's Investor Service, I'm not in the rating agency. Okay. I'm also on the board of directors of MGIC, a large mortgage insurer, and vice chair of the board of a nonprofit community development financial institutions that makes investments across the country in underserved communities. I'd like to make 3 points as well. I think we've all learned that that's about as many as we can make and people can digest. Point number one, you got a lot of work to do, a lot of budget issues dead ahead, one coming up in a few weeks. Have to extend spending authority for the government by the end of April. But I think the biggest budget issue this year is the Treasury debt limit. It's very important that that is resolved in a timely way. By my calculation, this has to be done by October 5th, give or take, but I don't think any longer than October 5th. And not addressing the debt limit in a timely way will be very costly. Not for a while, because I think markets have become conditioned to believe that when push comes to shove, you're going to act and solve this problem. So it's not going to be an issue today, it's not going to be an issue a month from now, but as we get closer, at some point, this is going to become a very significant issue. And it'll be very costly, even if we don't breach the debt limit. We did a study looking at the last time we went through this back in late 2013. Interest rates did rise as we came up to the limit. And if you do a bit of work and calculation, we found that it cost taxpayers about $500 million, just that brinkmanship around the limit and the effect that it had on interest rates. Of course, the limit was increased. If we solved that problem, the issue was resolved, and we moved forward and everything was okay. But if we actually do not solve this issue and we breach the debt limit, I don't agree. I don't think there's any way to prioritize here. Maybe you can do it in a technical sense, but effectively, I think financial markets will crater, and it'll have very serious implications for economic growth, jobs, and the cost to taxpayers will be enormous. Very bad idea. Point number two, I would recommend that you do away with the statutory debt ceiling. It's a bad idea. It's anachronistic and can be very destructive. I don't think it helps in terms of making good policy decisions. If that's a step too far, I would recommend perhaps adopting ability to pay rules. The idea would be that every time you have a bill for spending, taxes, annual appropriation bill, you have to make sure that you have sufficient future tax revenue and borrowing authority to be able to meet the deficit requirements as calculated by the Congressional Budget Office. I think this would impose some discipline. You would have a debate around this issue every time you voted for a spending bill or a tax bill that added to the future budget deficit. So still very, very important, but it doesn't lead to the situation where we have coming up now, and we have this drop-dead date, and a lot of havoc can be created by breaching it. So I would recommend eliminating the debt ceiling, but if barring that ability to pay. Finally, the third point, we have very serious long-term fiscal issues. I think both of the other folks here testified and did a very nice job of explaining that. So we have to make some changes. And I do think that will require some entitlement reform, particularly around the growth in healthcare costs. That is the key to Medicare, Medicaid, and really the budget going forward. But I do think the best thing we can do in the most immediate future is focus on things that can improve economic growth. Just to give you some numbers, for every 0.1 percentage point increase in GDP growth, that will reduce budget deficits over a 10-year period by $300 billion. So if we can enact policies, for example, that raises expected growth over the next 10 years from 2% per annum GDP to, let's say, 2.5%, that will save $1.5 trillion off the 10-year budget, $150 billion a year. So the work you're doing now with regard to corporate tax reform, immigration reform will be very important, infrastructure, those are the kinds of things I think we need to really focus on, get that done, get growth up, and that will help to address our long-term fiscal issues. They won't solve them, but that, I think, is the best approach at the current time to focus on those things. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you all for your testimony. You know, I think nobody, Republican or Democrat, wants to approach default or approach the deadline, and I agree with Senator Peters. If we got working on this in an advance notice, we're big boys and girls, we ought to be able to get it done in time. But if you get rid of deadlines, do you get rid of the impetus to do anything? And there have been reforms that have come from having the debt ceiling debate. And actually, the reforms, I think most of the time, have been good reforms. The problem has been the people. The people don't obey their own rules, meaning Congress doesn't obey their own rules. We've had 5 or 6 significant budgetary reforms. Budget Act of '74, Graham-Rudman-Hollings, pay-as-you-go. I remember when I first ran pay-as-you-go, I think they said they broke it like 700 times in the first 3 years. It's sort of lack of resolve on our part, both parties. And both parties have their sacred cows they want to spend money on. So there's plenty of blame to go around. But I think if you had no limits, if you had no debt ceiling, we'd have no impetus to sort of force the issue to say we have to do something about it. Everybody knows we've got this exploding entitlement problem, and nobody's doing anything about it. The only thing that ever forces us to do anything about it is the debt ceiling deadline. In 2011, we had a big fight. The conservatives, we proposed cut, cap, and balance. We actually had a balanced budget that had a percentage of spending of GDP, and we didn't win the day. But actually, I think we forced the issue enough that we got the sequester, which I didn't think was enough at the time, but turned out to be the best thing we probably did in the last 10 years. And now it's been defeated by right and left, both sides at fault. Military wants more money, the left wants more domestic spending, and lo and behold, we have, the sequester's been evaded every time. I think Mr. Walker had really the most important point that I heard throughout that is that one time Congress controlled 90% of the spending, and now nearly 70% of it's not under our control. And I mean, the point is we've got to do something about entitlements. And my side's as guilty of this as the others, and some of these are simply mechanistic things. It's demographics. It's nobody's fault. We have more older folks now and less younger folks. I mean, we've got to figure out how to do it. We're having less children. I mean, we've got to do something about, raising the age of eligibility, and Republicans and Democrats did it together in the 80s. But I guess what I'd like to hear from each of you is your comments on how we'd fix the situation, how we address the entitlement problem, or just your comments on, whether a process type of reform like a Budget Control Act of '74, something like that, will work. We'll start with Mr. Walker, and we'll work our way down.
Well, first, I think that we have to be honest how we keep score. We've got this number up here, $19.854 trillion. The real number is about $80 trillion, because when you end up looking at unfunded Social Security, Medicare, unfunded civilian military pensions, retiree health care, environmental cleanup costs, et cetera, most of which are in the financial statements, but they're not on the balance sheet, and those numbers are bigger, and frankly, they're growing faster than this number. So we have to be honest about what the nature and scope and magnitude of the problem is. Secondly, I think we also have to work with our terminology. I think sometimes we cause our own problems because we call things, for example, entitlements. There's only two things guaranteed under the Constitution of the United States, only two. Number one, debt issued by the United States, which I would argue is both debt issued to the public and debt issued to the so-called trust funds. And secondly, Union Civil War pensions. And I think we've paid all of those. I'm from Alabama. They didn't guarantee our pensions. I think I know why. But, but those are the only things that are guaranteed. Now, what do? In 2012, I went on a 10,000-mile, 27-state national fiscal responsibility bus tour. And in two states in particular, Ohio, which was a swing state in the north, and Virginia, a swing state in the south. Alice Rivlin and I addressed a demographically representative group of voters in those two states with the facts, the truth, and the tough choices. And after doing that, asked them to give us electronic confidential feedback on reforms in the following areas: budget process and controls, Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, health care, defense, taxes, government organization operations, and political reforms. Specific illustrative reforms designed to get debt to GDP down to 60% by then, at that time 2030, now 2035, and to be able to do it with everything on the table.
And so you asked these groups, like a focus group, so what did they
They
say?
were demographically representative.
What did they say about raising the age of eligibility?
Correct.
For Social Security? What was the response?
And we got 77% to 90+% support for packages of reforms in all the areas that I just talked to you about, okay?
Including people even allowing the age of eligibility to rise?
Correct. And we were able to do it because we got them to agree first on two things. Well, three things. Are we on an imprudent, unsustainable path? 97% said yes after they had the full story. Secondly, should our goal be to stabilize debt to GDP at a reasonable and sustainable level? That way, it's pro-growth, but with fiscal responsibility. I think about 90% agreed on that. And then 6 principles and values to guide reform. Pro-growth, socially equitable, culturally acceptable, mathematical integrity, politically feasible, and meaningful bipartisan support. Now, there's details I could go into if you want. But after doing that, after agreeing there's a problem, here's the goal, here's the principles and values, then we showed them a range of solutions designed to achieve that, and we got 77 to 90+% support. That's not how things were done in this town, okay?
Seem to be working here. Dr. DeRugi?
I agree. It's a difficult act to follow. So, sorry. It's a difficult act to follow, and I agree entirely with what you were saying. And it's interesting because it echoed a lot of pollings that I've seen also that shows that when you actually present people with the trade-offs, when you say, for instance, do you want this government service? People will say, oh, yes. Do you want more of it? Oh, yes. But when you say at which price, then people are more willing to start actually talking about the kind of trade-offs they would be willing, what they would be willing to sacrifice, whether they actually would want to see that program cut. So it's kind of interesting, and I think unfortunately in this town, there's not a lot of interest to talk about real trade-offs. The other thing that is pretty clear is that we know how to reduce debt to GDP ratio. I mean, first, we know that there is an impact on growth, and I agree that we need to grow the economy, but we're not going to get our way. I agree that it is a priority, and it's a priority for everyone, but we can't overstate how important it is for low-income Americans to see the economy grow. But if you want to reduce debt to GDP, we're not going to grow ourselves out of this debt. So we're going to have to address our spending. And we know how to reduce our debt to GDP ratio. If you do a review of the literature on fiscal adjustments, what you find is that the countries that have actually implemented fiscal adjustment packages that are made mostly of spending cuts, and in particular, and not surprisingly, of the social transfers, the so-called entitlement spending, which you're totally right. I mean, we know we're not entitled to them. It's been proven by the Supreme Court, and Congress can just change the law at any time. Those countries actually managed to reduce their debt to GDP ratio. On the other hand, countries that try to do kind of a halfway thing of raising taxes and cutting spending didn't succeed, and one of the reasons is because they would raise taxes and not really follow through on the spending, and they wouldn't actually do the spending cuts where they needed to be, meaning do fundamental structural changes. And the thing that's important is that, so we know what to do. There's multiple ways to do it, multiple solutions. And what's important is also going back to economic growth. There's always a lot of people saying, well, if you implement these type of packages, right, it's going to have a depressive effect on the economy, where actually economists agree there's a consensus that in the long term, it's actually beneficial for the economy. And there is still a debate on the consequences in the short term. But the question is like, well, I will agree also with Mr. Zandi that yes, breaching the debt ceiling or even having some of these conversations or getting that close has a cost. I mean, in a sense, we're getting a taste of what's going to happen to the American people if we do nothing. And it's just like constantly pushing back and kicking the can down the road in the name that it has a cost today is irresponsible. And we absolutely need to do something. And see, if I can say one more thing, reducing the cost of healthcare is important. And unfortunately, a lot of the conversation in this time is actually place its focus in the wrong place. Constantly talking about how we can reform the way we provide health insurance is the wrong thing to talk about. I'm not saying it's not important, but it kind of ignores the fact that third-party payer, whether it's the government or insurance, actually contribute to the problem. One of the things that we would be better to do is sure the government provide for the neediest in terms of health coverage, but also bring as much innovation and free the supply side of healthcare in order to bring the kind of innovation that we've seen in other sectors like technology and many other sectors, which raises quality and reduces prices. And that is unfortunately a conversation we're not having enough.
Dr. Zandi?
Yeah, I'll give you 4 suggestions. This first suggestion is, I don't think I'd use the debt limit as a way to effectuate change. It's a matter of benefit and costs, and I think the costs are very significant, particularly if you breach the debt limit. We have obviously not gotten there yet, but it's the costs there are obviously uncertain, unknown, but a prudent planner would want to go down that path, and therefore it's not really credible to think that that's going to have a significant effect on the behavior in terms of solving these long-term fiscal issues. It's a judgment, but I think the cost there could be quite substantive and shouldn't be discounted, particularly given the uncertainty around those costs. Second thing I'd say is, at this point in time, I think, just to reiterate my oral remark, I would focus on growth. I mean, you're thinking about policies that could help promote growth. Corporate tax reform is a very good idea. I think immigration reform is the most obvious way. More highly skilled immigrants into the country is the most obvious way to lift growth and address our long-term fiscal issues. You brought to your point about demographics, and infrastructure spending also key. Third, if I were king for the day and you're focusing on Social Security and how you would solve that, and you're proposing raising the age of retirement, the path I would take would be different. I'd say let's raise the payroll cap. It's eroded over time. When Social Security was put on the plan in the 30s, it was 90% plus of eligible earnings. Now we're down to 80. Let's just put it back to 90. And the second thing I'd do is I'd adopt a chain-weighted CPI. That would affect Social Security benefits. It'd also affect the tax code and some of the parameters in the tax code. So if I were going to solve Social Security, if that's what you were focused on, those are the kinds of things I'd do before raising the retirement age. And finally, the real solution, in my view, to solving our long-term fiscal issues is really the growth in the cost of healthcare. That is the key thing. But that's not going to be something you're going to solve today, next year, or the year after, just given this situation that we're in, the politics of all of this. So my advice would be, let's do these other things. They're doable. They will have significant benefits. And let's come back to this when we're a few years down the road and take another crack at it. Because these long-term fiscal problems are not going away. They're here for 20, 30, 40 years. So, let's do what we can do, not beat our heads against some of these other smaller things that aren't going to really make a difference. It's really about the growth in healthcare costs.
Senator Peters?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you to the panelists, your testimony and the conversation that we're having here, which is refreshing to have a hearing like this where we can really just have a conversation back and forth, not as formalized as these usually are. And I appreciate the frankness of all of you. First off, Mr. Walker, I listened with great interest in the panels that you held around the country with a variety of groups, and I listened to that with interest because I have done that myself in my district, not for a few years, but a few years ago we had a number of sessions where we had a cross-sections of folks. A lot of this was a few years ago when I was in the House and the Tea Party movement was in full bloom, and the folks who were there were heavily represented. Tea Party folks were heavily represented, but it was all sorts of groups of people coming together. I will tell you, my results were different than your results at each of those meetings, where there wasn't that sort of consensus that came out of it. As folks were saying, and we added the tax element, which I haven't heard panels, we haven't talked about taxes. I guess you did a little bit, yes, Mr. Walker, but folks were all for tax cuts. They thought those were pretty good until they realized it wasn't solving their issue with the deficit, and they couldn't do that. And so, and then when it talked about cuts, most of them were all in favor of cutting foreign aid. That was top of their list, but they realized that didn't have much impact whatsoever on the budget. They weren't really excited about cutting Social Security or Medicare, and so in the end of it, we didn't get that kind of consensus. So I'd love to talk with you more at some point in the future as to how we bring folks together, because that's kind of the crux of the problem, is how do we bring America together to have this kind of comprehensive adult conversation that we need to have, and to understand that, in my mind, to deal with this, I always explain that this is a three-legged stool, and we can't talk about dealing with the deficit unless you're dealing with all three legs, and that's tax policy, and it's spending, and it's growth. And none of those by themselves will work. You can't raise taxes enough to deal with it, you can't cut enough to deal with it, and you can't grow yourself out of it. You've got to do all three. And that's where you then run into the politics of it, where people don't want to, they just want tax cuts, they don't want to have anything that's revenue neutral or raises more revenue, or you can't have any cuts, or you think you can grow your way out. And I think that's been pretty clear by our panelists that this is a pretty complex issue that we have to handle all the way. And particularly when you're dealing with entitlements. I've heard a couple of you say that we know that these are not entitlements. I will tell you, ask any person of my constituents, and I agree with them, these are entitlements. These are things that people have paid in their entire life. And if you tell them that they've paid into a system for their entire life, that they should get something back. It's like their pension plan, if they've been contributing to their pension plan, and to say, well, we've changed the rules. We know you paid into this for the last 30 years, and we know you're counting on a dignified retirement, but hey, we changed the rules. That's not something that's going to be palatable to nearly everybody, and I agree that folks are, if you pay into a system, and those are the rules, and you played by the rules, you should expect that it'll actually be there for you. So these are things that we grapple with, and why it's difficult to bring all of our colleagues together. But let me ask a more specific question to the debt limit and to Dr. Zandi. You've talked about the cost associated with the debt limit, because we have to figure out how to force this. And I agree with all three of you. We've got to force these kinds of decisions. I agree with the chairman. We've got to force this. But the question is this tool the appropriate one? Because I'm afraid we're heading to another crisis coming up, and the pattern hasn't been very good that this has actually had these kinds of frank discussions. I agree, I don't think we're likely to eliminate the debt limit. That's probably not going to happen, but I think we should understand the cost associated with it. You talked about the impact of the markets and the cost of the last crisis or ones, although I know in your testimony you also talked about the fact that markets are now starting to realize, well, Congresses just do this. This is all games that they play, and they go back and forth, and it's just another example of the dysfunction that exists in the U.S. Congress, is that we get to this crisis, but they're going to just pass it as soon as it comes to that crisis point. So my question is, if that's the case, is this even losing its viability as a tool, in the fact that in the past, the markets would react negatively, and my colleagues would say, oh my gosh, we better do something here because the markets are performing badly. This is having an impact on the economy. Yeah. We better get our act together. But now it's not like we're even getting that pressure until at the very end, and then it's too late, and then it could be catastrophic, potentially. Is that a fair assessment of where we are and why this is kind of a dangerous thing to be thinking about right now?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, if you think back to the 2011 experience, the summer of 2011, you mentioned that in your opening remarks about the downgrading of the debt by S&P. As soon as the letter was written by, I believe it was Treasury Secretary Geithner, I can't remember to whom, Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi, the markets already started to react. You could actually see it in the markets, and the tension in markets started to build pretty quickly. And that may have put, you would think, starting to put pressure on policymakers. Oh, we've got to do something here, or otherwise markets are going to cave. But now they've been conditioned. We've gone down this path a number of times, again in 2013, and the letter was sent. Secretary Mnuchin sent a letter to House Speaker Ryan, and no one's even talking about it. I mean, it's like literally no one's talking about it. This would have been news, in 2013, and big news in 2011. So I think the markets are being conditioned here to expect, you finally solve this, and there's no pressure. If the markets don't react, if stock prices aren't going down, if credit spreads aren't gapping out, if credit default swap spreads aren't widening, where's the pressure? But at some point, and there will be a point, everyone's going to wake up and say, oh my gosh, what's going on? Boom. And at that point, it's going to be very costly to taxpayers, because we're all going to pay, we're talking about interest on the debt, well, interest rates are going to spike and it's going to cost us. So that's all that short-term money that the Treasury issues is going to be issued at a much higher interest rate, and that's going to cost taxpayers. And to what end? We're going to do something with the Treasury debt limit, and everyone knows it. So I'm not sure. Again, it's a matter of judgment, but my sense is this isn't the way to achieve the kinds of things you want to achieve here, and it could be very costly.
Just before I get to Mr. Walker, if I may, the complacency works, I think, two ways. One is that policymakers think, well, we don't have the pressure because the markets aren't reacting this way to do it. And then there's a complacency not to do anything. And then there's also the feeling, well, then maybe it's okay if we breach a debt limit because the markets don't seem to be reacting to any of this. We're not seeing any pressure, and then it adds to the danger level as well. And we heard a lot of conversations, well, the markets really aren't reacting. Maybe we can find other ways to get through this and prioritize or whatever it may be, which I think is potentially very problematic. Mr.
Can I make one other point? There was we actually did default on debt briefly because of a technical mistake. And the Treasury was back in early 1970s, where the Treasury, because of a computer glitch, didn't actually pay on time. And there's been academic research that shows that, in fact, that raised interest rates for a very long period of time. Just that technical error. So if you actually get to a point where we don't pay, that would be very, very costly to us. And at the end of the day, the AAA credit of the United States is the bedrock of the global financial system. We just shouldn't mess around with that. That is a given, and messing around with that could be very, very significantly costly.
No, my time's expired, but we want to hear from you.
A couple things quickly. First, I used to be a trustee of Social Security and Medicare, one of the prior hats that I had. And while Social Security, you're paying a payroll tax during your working life, and while Part A under Medicare, you're paying a payroll tax during your working life, and so is the employer, you're not for B and D. Part B and Part D under Medicare are the ones that are the most underfunded, and people don't pay for that until they're actually eligible for the program to begin with. And most of the cost of those programs are funded out of general revenues. And secondly, I think the big difference between the results that you got in your session and that I got is that you didn't have a representative group of voters. You basically had adverse selection. People who wanted to come, including the extremes.
I did.
Tend to come disproportionately, right? And so having a representative group was important to try to get better results, because unfortunately the extremes from both sides tend to be disproportionately represented in our political process. And the last thing is the process matters, and I'll give you one example. In 1998, President Clinton wanted to reform Social Security, and that was right before I was appointed as Comptroller General of the United States, and I'd been a trustee of Social Security and Medicare. AARP and the Concord Coalition came together, worked with the White House to try to do several forums where experts like myself stated the facts, spoke the truth, talked about the options, engaged people with electronic confidential balloting, and the elected officials observed. They didn't talk, they observed. And that resulted in some dramatic evidence that people were willing to accept some trade-offs. And I believe that we would have had Social Security reform before the beginning of this millennium had there not been a personal problem of the president, which caused him to lose political capital. And quite frankly, the kind of reforms that we would have done back then, because I was part of that, pretty much going to be the same kind of reforms that ultimately we do. The question is, when are we going to do it?
Thank you.
Process matters.
Right. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Walker. Thank you.
Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you, Chairman Paul and Ranking Member Peters. I'm really glad to be here for my first Federal Spending Oversight and Emergency Management Subcommittee hearing. Privileged to join this subcommittee, and thank you to the panelists. It's nice to see you again, Mr. Walker. I do have a couple of questions. First, starting with Dr. Zandi, I'd like to talk about the cost of government defaults and shutdowns and how that impacts our national debt. In your testimony, you warned that if the Treasury were to default on its obligations, the economic impact would be devastating, potentially more severe than the Great Recession. In addition to the incredible damage that would cause to our families and businesses in New Hampshire and all around the country. It seems to me that the damage to our economy, you estimate it at a possible 5% decline in GDP, would also reduce tax revenues and then therefore increase the national debt considerably. Is that an assessment you agree with, or?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that was a scenario where we breached the limit. So October 5th is the limit.
Right.
We breach it, and we go on for another month without resolving it, and we don't make Social Security payments. And that is the scenario that you're describing. And you're right, just to give you context, the 5% decline in GDP that you cited for the scenario is equal to roughly the decline during the Great Recession. In the Great Recession, the debt-to-GDP ratio of the U.S. rose by 35 to 40 percentage points. So that gives you a sense of the magnitude of that kind of a recession and what kind of impact it would have on the budget.
Okay. So that description is one of the reasons I'm hopeful that both parties can come together to deal with the debt ceiling well before the deadline without manufacturing a crisis by bringing in unrelated political issues that really force impossible choices. And I think people in both parties would agree that they get put in this situation when political issues get added on. I'm also concerned that government shutdowns can have much of the same effect. And, you know, I lived through the shutdown in 2013 as the governor of New Hampshire, watching, you know, the White Mountain National Forest shut on Columbus Day weekend, which is one of our prime tourist periods in the state. And to that point, Dr. Zander, you previously said that the 2013 government shutdown resulted in a $20 billion hit to our nation's GDP. As with default, shutdowns have a real impact on families and businesses and also reduce tax revenues, once again increasing our national debt. So, Dr. Zandi, do you agree that costly shutdowns increase the federal debt and that if Congress is serious about cutting the deficit and reducing our debt, as I am, that we should be avoiding those kind of costly defaults and shutdowns that hurt our bottom line?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to give you a rule of thumb, for every week that the government shuts down, it costs 20 basis points of annualized GDP growth. So you can do the arithmetic. Okay. And here's another really good rule of thumb. For every lost dollar of GDP, you lose, the deficit will increase by 40 to 50 cents. So the arithmetic here is pretty daunting.
Well, thank you. I'm truly hopeful that the threat of these kinds of consequences will help ensure that senators from both sides of the aisle can come together and work out a clean budget deal without any poison pills. This is a question to the full panel, because it's a related point. Dr. Zandi notes in his testimony that political uncertainty in Washington is already very high and has been since the shutdown in 2013. As this uncertainty grows, businesses are more reluctant to invest or hire workers, families become more cautious in their spending, and GDP growth slows. So if each of you could address how uncertainty can impact economic growth and long-term investment, and can you discuss how Congress creates uncertainty when it passes short-term continuing resolutions rather than annual appropriations, or when it threatens defaults or shutdowns for political purposes? And Mr. Walker, I'd start with you.
Believe it or not, I'm 65 years old. No. Congress has passed timely budget and appropriation bills 4 times in 65 years. That is an F minus, okay? Business relies upon some reasonable ability to predict what the future might be. And in the absence of that reasonable ability to predict, there is a cost. There's clearly an economic cost, there's clearly an opportunity cost, et cetera. And so clearly we need budget reforms. You know, frankly, the only thing under the Constitution of the United States that is expressed and enumerated for both houses of the Congress to do every year, there's only one, and that's appropriations. Yeah. And yet it doesn't do it, all right? At the same point in time, rules like pay-as-you-go rules aren't adequate because that assumes that we're in a sustainable position and all we need to do is pay for new stuff when in fact we can't afford what we already have. Mm-hmm. So I think, yes, we need more certainty, but we also need to start treating the disease rather than the symptoms. and that's part of what this hearing's all about.
Thank you. Doctor?
I mean, I agree. Uncertainty is a problem. Markets don't like uncertainty. It creates paralysis. But I will also say that, I mean, Congress it's not the only way by adopting continuing resolution time and time again that Congress creates uncertainty. I mean, you look at the tax code is replete with temporary tax provisions, which require to be extended or not. I mean, the drama every so often over the tax extenders it was supposed to be a one-time thing in 1988, and it's been happening all the time ever since. Creates uncertainty. Writing massive regulations that will take years to write all the regs create massive amount of uncertainty. So the government has this tendency of yes, creating massive uncertainty, and it's not a good thing. That being said, I mean, I will say again, there's no doubt. So default shutdowns are not, you know, they're not desirable things at all. But waiting is not an option. The government is not going to meet its promises under any circumstances right now, and it's certainly not going to meet its promises with this level of debt. Take Social Security, for instance. I mean, when the trust funds are empty, we know what's going to happen. I mean, by law, benefits are going to be cut by 25%. We know this. And people, the lowest income Americans, those who really, really, truly depend on Social Security, are going to be hurting. And the idea that we can push that can down the road because Congress is going to change the law once again, I think is foolish. Because by then, the debt to GDP ratio will be, 150%? It's going to be already $30 trillion gross debt in 2017, 140%. I mean, I don't think you guys will have the luxury of actually changing the law to say we keep everything. And so I just think that I would rather for my children and future generation that we assume, that we are responsible today and start passing the reforms. And if we need to do it by using the debt ceiling, again, there are ways to not default. The idea of threatening of default all the time as if, and which is, by the way, the conversation in 2011 was one where there was no way to actually use extraordinary measures. There was no way to prior writing. I mean, it's not that these are desirable things, but it's not true. We know it's not true. And if it allows us to not continue pushing this can down the road, I mean, in the name of my children, I would rather take that risk and rock the boat a little bit today.
Thank you. Senator Lankford.
Thank you. Can we set some context real quick? We're talking about interest and debt issues. What do you anticipate the interest payments will be 10 years from now for the United States?
Can I tell you just
Go ahead.
right now projected by CBO is going to be close to $800 billion. That's assuming that the interest rates stay what it's projected to be.
Right, modest growth in interest
almost
rates.
$800 billion.
Dr. Walker, anything you want to mention?
Sounds right. That's modest growth in interest rates, not returning to the levels of the 1990s, by the way, below that. It's the interest rate risk is arguably one of our highest risks. It's the fastest growing expense on a percentage basis, and we get nothing for it.
Right. It's been one of the areas that I try to push a lot of people that I talk to say it is the creeping element in the budget that no one can pay attention to because you assume it's never going to get that high, but it is coming. And it actually squeezes out all discretionary spending just for interest, which we will do. So let me ask a question. How are other nations handling issues like debt limits?
I don't know of any other nation that has a debt limit. There are nations that have what I advocated, which is a debt to GDP limit with automatic targets and triggers and enforcement mechanisms if you violate it.
Right.
Things have to happen. Right now, things don't happen. And so as a result, we've gone from $5.7 trillion in total debt subject to the debt ceiling limit to almost $20 trillion since 2000. And we still haven't done anything to deal with the structural driver of the fiscal imbalance.
Yeah, relative to other developed economies, we have a very anachronistic, unusual approach to this. There's no other country that has anything that comes close to a debt limit or even shuts the government down over these issues.
Right. So I asked the question of several other international leaders last year in the same question, and I was aware there's no debt limit out there anywhere else in the world, that we do it very different. But I asked a question of another international leader and said, what happens if you get to the end and then you tip over and you have a government shutdown? And he laughed. He said, we have a new election the next week because all of us are out. Parliament dissolves and everybody's out and done. This didn't work. And we're all gone. That's how we handle it, to be able to make sure that is actually that we actually take advantage of our responsibility.
But of course, they don't. So if you look at the debt to GDP of almost every developed economy in the world, it's higher than the United States at this point in time.
Right.
I was going to say, I mean, it's hard to think of a country we should use as a model. So I really don't think that having a debt ceiling or not is really.
So the question is the combination of several things here. I have proposed several areas to be able to address, to be able to get on top of this. Several members of this committee have as well. One is we've got to avoid the constant fear of a government shutdown. That doesn't help us. That does hurt our economy every single time. We have to have a way to be able to solve that. But we also have to be able to bring fiscal responsibility. I have a bill called the Government Shutdown Prevention Act, which puts the consequences on Congress and the executive branch, holds harmless every other agency, but puts the pressure where the pressure should be for us to get to appropriations. And so we can finally get to doing appropriation bills and to be able to move on. I have noticed in the short time that I've been here that Congress only acts when it has a deadline. If there is no deadline, we never seem to get to action on it. Hence, things like immigration reform and so many things we discuss year after year, but with no deadline, there's no time to do it. That's why a debt ceiling suddenly creates this false deadline. That's why you've got all these other entities when you deal with budget times that it creates a deadline. So it is important, I think, that we actually accomplish something with that to be able to move, to not have a shutdown, to be able to keep maintaining where we are, but to be able to solve some of the issues. When I ask about the issue about a debt ceiling, I believe Congress will always expand the debt ceiling. We will find a way every time to do it for fear of default and what that means internationally to international economies. The question is it useful to us to be able to actually accomplish something with it and to be able to find a way to be able to say, how do we get a hold of our interest and our debt payments at some point? So, Mr. Walker, you have mentioned several times debt to GDP or other mechanisms that are there globally. Is there a way that we can deal with a debt ceiling vote that also has a marker on it saying the debt ceiling increases if our deficit numbers decrease by a certain percentage? So let's say Congress were to say, at this point, 2 years from now, our deficit decreases 10%. Then the debt ceiling increases and it sets specific targets for Congress to be able to work towards. What I'm trying to work towards is not just we have debt ceiling votes, because I think we're always going to have debt ceiling votes and there'll be a way that Congress finds to pass it every time, but to have a meaningful process to say that's a marker to say we're failing to get on top of this. How do we get us back to balance and to start bringing this down?
If you're going to have metrics, and I'm for metrics and mechanisms, targets, triggers, and enforcement mechanisms, I really think you ought to change, rather than deficits and rather than total debt, to go to debt to GDP. And why do I say that? That's what really matters. That way you can pursue pro-growth policies, and we've talked about a number, but you have to have fiscal constraint. And that fiscal constraint requires everything to be on the table. It requires discretionary spending to be on the table, it requires mandatory spending to be on the table, and it requires tax expenditures to be on the table, which is $1.2 trillion a year, and largely not looked at all. And so I think you need to move towards that approach. The other thing, there's a group that I'm a national co-founder of. It's called No Labels. And one of the things that it advocated with regard to the budget and appropriations process is no budget, no pay. That if the Congress does not pass a budget and the appropriate appropriations bills by a certain date, that Congress doesn't get paid until it does. Now, there are states that have done that.
Right.
I think California is one of them. They hadn't had a problem since then. They have other problems.
Lots.
But they don't have that. But they don't have that problem.
I would not exactly pull California out as a model
No,
of efficiency and spending.
Well, no, they're not. No, they're not. But they're ranked number 40 out of
They,
50.
but what they have found a way, and not to go pick on California, because their folks are not here to be able to defend themselves, but what their legislators have done as a result of that is find a way to be able to hide their debt in other places and to be able to bury it in other ways.
And we do that too.
I agree. That has been the challenge that I've faced in when you do a debt to GDP. Every time you do debt to GDP, there's some way to be able to fudge the numbers and to be able to fudge exactly which GDP number that is and how you figure it and what you do. I'm trying to find a way that you can't fudge the numbers. So when I look at specific targets, I understand economic growth has got to be a major priority. But if you look at percentage reduction of the deficit, that assumes you're going to have to find a way to have economic activity and growth. You're going to have to control spending. You're going to have to find a way to be able to do that, whether it be revenue or whether it be cutting. You've got to find a way to be able to do that. But that is a clean number that if you set a date, you can't fudge it. And in this town, everyone fudges the numbers. I'm trying to find a clean way to say, let's do a number, no one can hide.
It may have to be a transition. Yeah, you may have to do something like that.
Can I add something about fudging? You're so right. I mean, like, debt to GDP limit hasn't worked for Europe very well. I mean, Greece. Yeah, yes, they don't enforce it, but it's ultimately it boils down to this implementation, right? And how do you tie the hands of Congress? And that's a 20 trillion going on 30, going on $40 trillion question is how do you tie the hands of Congress? And that's really hard. It's really hard. And I just wanted to say something about tax expenditure. I don't entirely disagree with you, but we have to be very careful. Not those $1.2 trillion should be on the table because some of those tax expenditures are meant to mitigate the double taxation that exists in the tax code. And so I think we have to be careful on not looking at them all as a potential source of revenue unless we fundamentally reform our tax code and adopt a flat tax and get rid of all double taxation of saving and investment.
I'm over time, but let me make one quick comment. Where we are right now in budgeting, I'm not sure it's how do you tie the hands of Congress. It's how do you untie the hands of Congress, because most everything is on autopilot around here. And if you get to the end of a budget year, you do a continuing resolution, even discretionary spending ends up being on autopilot. So this is a matter of giving Congress a deadline when they have to act and do something and can't just sit back and say status quo will work, and status quo is driving us over the cliff.
I have a suggestion for you if you want to hear it. Do you have time? No? Okay. So ability to pay rules in every piece of legislation that adds to projected budget deficit. So ability to pay is equal to projected tax revenues plus borrowing authority must cover the deficits the CBO expects over the 10-year budget horizon. So, and that would be for every piece of legislation that would add to future budget deficits. So every time you vote for a piece of legislation that will add to deficits, you have to also vote for the borrowing authority to achieve that.
How's that different than the PAYGO rules that already exist that are waived by Congress routinely?
Well, I don't, if you waive them, you waive them, but that would be a rule that, instead of having a treasury debt limit where it's cataclysmic if you go over it and therefore it's not credible that you'll go over it, that you have this as something that would impose discipline every single time you voted for something.
Thank you. And I think that illustrates a lot of the problem is it's not that we haven't tried, not that we don't have processes in place. It's a people problem. Right. We don't obey our own rules. But I think Mr. Walker made a good point earlier when he said that basically 70% of the budget is not controlled by us. We need to untie our hands. We need to have our hands in all of it. But we just let the mandatory spending go on and on and on. And I actually think there are some things we could do. I mean, Democrats and Republicans did raise the age of eligibility back in '83, and they raised taxes. And really, to my mind, as far as Social Security, we had a bill that I put forward 6 years ago. 2/3 of the problem was fixed by raising the age over like a 20 or 30-year period. That fixed 2/3 of the shortfall. The remaining third we did by means testing. And you can argue whether you should raise the taxes or means test it. They're still taking the bite from the wealthy more. The only reason I prefer means testing over taxes is means testing is on the tail end when you're not really creating jobs. You got all your wealth and you just take a little bit less Social Security. Taxes on the early side, I think, can have a disruptive effect on the market if we tax everybody on the full extent of their wealth. I'd rather have rich people get a lot less Social Security to pay for it. But you can fix it. I don't think those are emotional things, but we just keep putting it off. But how come we don't fix it? Senator Peters, tell us how to fix it and why we don't fix it.
So now that I'm a member of the panel,
It's a friendly question.
it is a friendly question. Well, I think when you talk about some of the things related to Social Security reform, one of the increasing the age, the problem with that is that not everybody can work longer. It's a situation for those of us who are blessed to be able to sit at a desk and in an air-conditioned environment and engage in our profession. I think many of us will probably work beyond 70 years old because for obvious reasons. A lot of the folks I represent lift heavy objects for a living, and their body doesn't necessarily last till 70 years, and they're outside in the cold and the extremes, and so it does have a disproportionate impact based on what people's jobs are. So I find there's generally more acceptance for raising the retirement age from folks who are in office jobs and who are usually very well paid versus everyday folks who are struggling and are concerned about that. If you look, I think, but if the problem is the underlying premise, and Dr. Zandi mentioned about this, or mentioned this fact, is that when Ronald Reagan and that group figured they would solve Social Security for the future, and they came together bipartisan. It was a great compromise that came together. But as you mentioned, it was roughly 90% of all income was captured by that Social Security tax that paid in. It was based on the premise everybody pays in, everybody gets it back, it captures most of the revenue. But what has happened since those Reagan years, as we all know, is that there's been an acceleration of income inequality at an accelerating rate. And so it's the fact that the folks at the very top have now I don't have the numbers in front of me here, but a very large percentage of total income goes to the folks at the very top. You know, if you really want to solve, the ideal way to solve Social Security, in my mind, is you raise everybody's income up so that we get back to the 90%, so we don't have this great gulf of not only income inequality, but of wealth inequality, which is even greater than the income inequality, which causes the problem. So to have a means test would generate revenue, but you'd need to generate an awful lot from that means test. It wouldn't be just not getting your Social Security. That wouldn't be enough, in my mind. I have to run the numbers. You probably run the numbers. That's not going to make up the difference, given the fact that you've had such a drop in the number or the amount of income that's covered because of growing inequality. And so that's why it has to be more comprehensive. And let me ask a question of the panel after I've answered my question from the chair. And then, and Mr. Walker, you want to make a comment, do that as well, please. But is that, as I mentioned in my opening question, that this is a three-legged stool, and we haven't talked a lot about taxes, and yet that's actually what's pending before us here, or likely to be pending before us in Congress very shortly as we look at tax reform. There are folks who would like to see if there's tax reform, and there's certainly ways that we should make this tax code a lot more efficient. We should get rid of this thick document and simplify it. I'm all about that, and bring more certainty, deal with some of the uncertainties associated with that. But I also think I don't know how we deal with this if we're not dealing with at least deficit neutral. We probably need to do more than deficit neutral, as long as you're also cutting spending and growing the economy. But you probably need to raise some revenue. Ideally, is what we're going to have to do. But at a minimum, you should be deficit neutral. And we will only make this problem worse. And if you look at President Trump's proposal, it was in the trillions of dollars, at least during the campaign that he was running, which doesn't seem like it fixed the problem. And folks around here love to give tax cuts. You know, that's a fun thing to go back home. But what you do is you're increasing the deficit dramatically, and that's more abstract. But we know it's very real. It's not abstract in terms of the everyday world that we live in. So kind of get your sense on this tax proposal. Are you concerned if it is something other than at least deficit neutral? And Dr. Zandi, you're shaking your head, but I'd like all of you to respond to it. Dr. Zandi?
Sure, I would be supportive of revenue neutral corporate tax reform. I think the House Republican plan in the proposal that's been forward by Congressman Brady is a pretty good plan. There's things to be worried about, particularly with regard to the border adjustment tax and some of the issues around transition and whether it violates WTO rules. But broadly speaking, on a reasonably dynamically scored basis, that would be a reasonable proposal. It's revenue neutral, roughly. Other than that, I would not be supportive of cuts in personal income taxes at that point, unless it's, you can do revenue neutral kind of taxation to lower marginal rates and broaden the base. But I think that should be the key criteria that when it's all said and done, Currently, federal revenue to GDP is 19%. That's where it should be. It should. I think we should work towards that end, try to make the tax code more efficient, work for us in a better way, promote growth. But I don't think we should reduce that. That's been the average amount of revenue raised as a percent of GDP for 35, 40 years. I don't think that should change at this point in time.
I agree with you that tax cuts should be deficit neutral, not revenue neutral. And there's just a lot of things we could cut, especially if we're talking over 10 years. And the House Republican bill is a good bill, especially the growth, the part that grows the economy. But the border adjustment tax is actually a terrible idea. It's something that's completely untested with extremely large amount of risks. And I mean, I could go on and on and on about this, but I think the goal, and outside from the border adjustment, there's other ways in the bill, that other provisions that raise revenue, and I think that proper tax reform will do a little bit. You cut some rates, you expand the base, so you do some revenue increase too. But I think deficit neutrality should be the goal, not revenue neutrality.
If I may just briefly, your opposition to the border tax, if that is taken out, the math doesn't work real well for the tax plan. Do you agree, or?
Yeah, it does. It doesn't work. It doesn't work really. That's true. I mean, but then
Not at all, in fact.
you could do a smaller package too, right? I mean, it's like we're talking about this. The discussion right now is as if this is the only. We need that. I mean, yes, yeah. The part that outside of the border adjustment tax is great. If we can't pass this, we go to something smaller. We will get a lot of growth from it, especially on the corporate income tax. I mean, I'd agree that, I mean, I would love to see reforms on the individual's side and reduction of rates, but this is not our priority. The corporate income tax side, I mean, our system is absolutely awful. It's anti-competition. We have the highest rate of all the OECD countries. We have a worldwide tax system. This needs to happen, and a lot of growth will come from this. But yes, the math doesn't work unless you also bring some spending cuts to the table, which the plan doesn't address at all.
Thank you. Mr.
It
Waters.
should be deficit neutral, and one of the real questions would be is whether and to what extent you consider economic growth, in calculating that as to whether or not it's deficit neutral. With regard to the Social Security, coming back to that real quick, keep in mind two things about 1983. They had no choice but to reach an agreement in 1983 because the trust fund was going to zero within a matter of months. If it went to zero, tens of millions of people would have had their checks cut. That was not politically feasible or acceptable. They had no choice. But secondly, when they made the reforms in 1983, they didn't consider known demographic trends. They only achieved actuarial balance over 75 years. They forgot that we've gone from 16 to 1 people working to retire to 3 to 1, going to 2 to 1 by 2035. Next time you reform Social Security, you have to recognize demographic realities. Demographics are destiny. And last, what we tested for Social Security reform, again, not advocating that this is necessarily the right answer, but what got 77% support for Social Security reform of a demographically representative group of voters was the following: raise but not eliminate the cap, considering 90% of taxable wages, which is what Reagan did back in the 80s.
70%, did you say?
90% of taxable.
No, but the support was 70%.
77% for a package. Now, you got to keep in mind, and that's how you have to do it. If you do individual things, forget it. You're not going to get people to come together. You have to vote on packages, all right? Raise a cap, gradually raise the retirement age 2 years over 20 to 30 years, but provide an exception for certain occupations where there aren't white-collar occupations. You have to do that. You have to recognize that reality. Make the benefits more progressive, so give a higher replacement rate to people near the poverty level, a somewhat lower replacement rate for people that are higher income, but don't fully means test it to make it a welfare program, and then consider going to an alternative form of CPI. Those got 77% support, and which is even good enough in the Senate, I think, you know, I mean.
Can I make one point about corporate tax reform that's going to be relevant to the debate, I think? And that is, I think it would be a mistake to try to get around the budget rules by sunsetting any tax proposal after a 10-year budget window. That particularly with regard to growth. I mean, if we go to corporate tax reform and the idea here is to promote growth, if in fact you sunset it after 10 years, just to make it work from a reconciliation perspective, that will, because of back to the policy uncertainty, significantly reduce the economic value of that kind of proposal. You're not accomplishing what you need to approach. So this, in my view, that would be an error to go down that path. If you're going to do it, you got to do it in an honest way.
Well, I want to thank the panel for coming. I think we've had a good discussion, and I hope this is a beginning. I wish we had sort of a standing committee that were actually looking at entitlements. If I were in charge, there would be a committee looking at Social Security and Medicare and saying, how do we come together? And it'd be a permanent committee. It'd be the most important committee around here. And we would devote time and resources day in and day out. And I think we could. I think we eventually could come to some arrangement. The idea that it's harder for people who do physical work to, you know, that there may be some accommodation, sure, I'm sure we could have found an agreement there. Does the age have to go up, though? The age has to go up. It's an enormous part of how you fix costs. So 2/3 of the Social Security shortfall can be wiped out by raising the age. Can you have some exceptions for people who aren't able to work as long? You could. But there are all kinds of things. Which is worse, raising taxes on everybody or means testing? Are they kind of the same thing? You know, they're kind of the same thing. We could figure out how to do this, but we're not having the discussion. So I was pleased with the discussion today. This is a beginning. I appreciate you taking your time to come in, and thank you, Senator Peters, for being part of it.